On August 10, 1920, diplomats gathered in a porcelain workshop outside Paris to sign a treaty that would officially end the Ottoman Empire. The Treaty of Sèvres carved up Anatolia like a prize after centuries of imperial rule. Greece would control the western coast and the city of Smyrna. Armenia would become an independent state in the east. A Kurdish autonomous zone would stretch across the southeast. The straits connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean would be internationalized, controlled by foreign powers. France and Italy claimed their own zones of influence. What remained under Turkish control was a landlocked fragment in the center, barely a quarter of Anatolia. The Ottoman army would be limited to 50,000 men. Foreign courts would retain legal authority over their citizens on Turkish soil, a humiliating continuation of colonial-era privileges. The Sultan's government, operating from occupied Istanbul, signed the document. 3 years later, none of it existed. The Treaty of Sèvres was dead. In its place stood a completely different map, a completely different state, and a completely different treaty. The empire was gone, but Turkey survived, unified and independent, its borders defended and recognized. How that reversal happened, how a defeated empire became a victorious nation-state, is the story of the war and treaties that created modern Turkey. To understand the collapse, you have to start with the choice that made it inevitable. In 1914, the Ottoman Empire was already fragile. It had lost territory in the Balkans, North Africa, and the Mediterranean over the previous century. Rival powers, Britain, France, and Russia, had been carving away pieces for decades. When the First World War began, the Ottoman leadership made a calculated gamble. They allied with Germany and Austria-Hungary, hoping German military strength would protect them and help recover lost lands. That choice put the empire at war on multiple fronts simultaneously, against Russia in the Caucasus, Britain in Mesopotamia and Palestine, and insurgents across the Arab provinces. The empire lost. By 1918, British forces controlled Baghdad, Jerusalem, and Damascus. Arab forces, supported by Britain, had seized key cities along the Hejaz Railway. Russian advances in the east had been reversed after the Bolshevik Revolution pulled Russia out of the war, but the damage was done. The Ottoman military was exhausted. Supplies were gone. Soldiers were deserting. On October 30th, 1918, the Ottoman government signed the Armistice of Mudros aboard a British warship in the Aegean. The terms were harsh. Ottoman forces would demobilize. Allied troops could occupy any strategic point they deemed necessary. The straits would be open to Allied warships. Within weeks, British and French forces occupied Istanbul. Foreign soldiers patrolled the streets of the capital. The Sultan's government, led by Mehmed VI, remained in place, but it governed under occupation. The Allies had won the war. Now they had to decide what to do with the defeated empire. The answer came in pieces, through a series of decisions that assumed Ottoman compliance. In May 1919, Greece, with British and French backing, landed troops at Smyrna on the western Anatolian coast. The stated reason was to protect the Greek population there from Turkish violence. The real reason was territorial expansion. Greek forces began moving inland, occupying towns and villages. The Sultan's government in Istanbul protested, but it did not resist. It could not. The Ottoman army had been demobilized. Istanbul was occupied. Cooperation with the Allies seemed like the only path to lenient peace terms. But in Anatolia, away from the occupied capital, a different response was forming. Mustafa Kemal, an Ottoman general who had successfully defended Gallipoli in 1915 and led campaigns in Syria, left Istanbul in May 1919. Officially, he was sent to oversee the demobilization of remaining Ottoman forces in eastern Anatolia. Unofficially, he began organizing resistance. In July, he convened a Congress of nationalist delegates in Erzurum. In September, a second Congress met in Sivas. These gatherings produced a unified position. Any treaty that partitioned Anatolia or surrendered sovereignty would not be recognized. The nationalists declared that the true government of Turkey was not the Sultan's cabinet in occupied Istanbul, but a representative assembly that would speak for the nation's independence. In April 1920, that assembly, the Grand National Assembly, convened in Ankara, a small city in central Anatolia, far from Allied control. Mustafa Kemal was elected its president. Ankara now functioned as a rival government, claiming legitimacy over the same territory the Sultan's government claimed. For the Allies, this was an inconvenience, not a crisis. They continued negotiating with Istanbul. The result was the Treaty of Sèvres, signed in August 1920 by the Sultan's representatives. Sèvres was not a negotiation, it was a dictate. Greece received Smyrna and a large zone around it, with a referendum scheduled for 5 years later that everyone assumed would formalize permanent Greek control. Greece also kept eastern Thrace, the European side of the Straits. Armenia, which had briefly existed as an independent republic after the Russian collapse, would be restored with expanded borders deep into eastern Anatolia. President Woodrow Wilson of the United States was even asked to draw the boundaries, though the U.S. never ratified the treaty. A Kurdish autonomous region would be established in the southeast, with a path toward full independence if the League of Nations approved. Italy received a zone of influence in the southwest. France held the south, including Cilicia. The Straits would be demilitarized and governed by an international commission. The Ottoman Empire would retain control of a rump state in north-central Anatolia, but it would have no army capable of defending it, no economic independence, and no legal sovereignty over foreigners within its borders. The Ankara government rejected the treaty the day it was signed. It declared Sèvres null and void. But rejection alone meant nothing without the power to enforce it. And in the summer of 1920, Ankara was fighting on 3 fronts. Greek forces were pushing east from Smyrna. French forces occupied the southern coast and Cilicia. Armenian forces, backed by weapons and supplies from abroad, held territory in the east. The nationalist movement controlled the interior, but it was surrounded. The question facing Ankara was not whether to fight, but whether fighting could produce a different outcome than what the treaty had already imposed on paper. Military capacity was limited. The nationalists had inherited some Ottoman units that had refused to disband after the armistice, plus irregular volunteer forces, but they had no central command structure, no reliable supply lines, and no international recognition. The Allied powers considered Ankara a rebel movement. Recognition mattered because it determined access to weapons, credit, and diplomatic protection. Ankara had none of these, but the Greek campaign, which posed the most immediate territorial threat, suffered from its own constraints. Greek forces controlled the Smyrna region and had pushed inland, but the further they moved from the coast, the longer their supply lines stretched. The terrain favored defenders. Anatolia's interior is high plateau, arid and open in summer, frozen in winter, cut by mountain ranges that channel movement into predictable corridors. Greek units were fighting in hostile territory where the population did not welcome them. Every village they occupied required garrison troops. Every railroad they used required guards. The offensive that looked triumphant in Athens became, on the ground, a logistical problem with no clear endpoint. In January 1921, Greek forces launched a winter offensive toward Ankara, hoping to crush the nationalist government before it could consolidate. They advanced east from their coastal positions. The First Battle of İnönü, fought in January, stopped them. Turkish forces under Colonel İsmet, later known as İsmet İnönü, used the terrain to force a stalemate. The Greeks withdrew. In March, they tried again at the Second Battle of İnönü. Again, they were stopped. These were not decisive victories. The Greeks were not routed, but they were denied forward momentum, and momentum was what the invasion required. The setback strained relations between Greece and its allied backers. Britain had encouraged the Greek campaign, seeing Greece as a proxy that could enforce the treaty without requiring British troops, but France and Italy had different priorities. France wanted stability in Syria, its League of Nations mandate, and saw the Turkish nationalists as a manageable partner if properly approached. Italy had economic interests in Anatolia and resented Greek expansion into zones Italy had expected to control under Sèvres. Both countries began negotiating separately with Ankara. In October 1921, France signed the Treaty of Ankara with the nationalist government. France agreed to withdraw from Cilicia and recognize Turkish sovereignty over the region in exchange for economic concessions and a settled border with Syria. It was a tactical retreat. France decided that holding Cilicia was not worth the cost when it could secure its Syrian mandate through agreement instead. The withdrawal eliminated the southern front. Turkish forces could now concentrate against Greece. Italy followed similar logic. It pulled back from its southwestern occupation zone, maintaining only symbolic presence. Italy's calculation was commercial. A stable Turkish state would be a better trading partner than a fragmented Anatolia under prolonged conflict. By late 1921, the Allies were no longer unified. Britain continued supporting Greece, but it was doing so alone. The Eastern Front, against Armenia, had already been resolved. In late 1920, Turkish forces moved east and clashed with the short-lived Armenian Republic. At the same time, Soviet Russia invaded Armenia from the north. Armenia, squeezed between two larger powers and lacking external support, collapsed. The Treaty of Kars, signed in October 1921 between Ankara and the Soviet republics, formalized the eastern border. Armenia became a Soviet republic. The independent Armenian state promised by Sèvres no longer existed. The Kurdish autonomous region also never materialized. Kurdish tribal leaders, divided among themselves, were either co-opted into the nationalist movement or suppressed when they resisted. By 1921, the map that Sèvres had drawn in the east was irrelevant. That left Greece. The Greek army remained in western Anatolia, holding Smyrna and a deep occupation zone, but it was static. The offensives of early 1921 had failed. Supplying and maintaining an army hundreds of kilometers from its home base was draining Greek resources. Domestic political pressure in Greece was mounting. The campaign had been sold as a quick restoration of historic Greek territories. It had become a grinding occupation with no exit. In summer 1921, Greece launched one final major offensive. The objective was Ankara itself. If the nationalist capital fell, the resistance would collapse. Greek forces advanced in July. They pushed through central Anatolia, moving toward the Sakarya River, the last natural defensive line before Ankara. The Turkish forces fell back. The government prepared to evacuate Ankara if necessary. Everything depended on holding the river. The Battle of Sakarya lasted 22 days, from late August to mid-September 1921. It was not a single engagement, but a grinding series of attacks and counterattacks along a wide front. The Greek army tried to cross the river and break through. Turkish forces, now under unified command with Mustafa Kemal directly supervising, held the line. Casualties were heavy on both sides, but the Greeks could not break through. By mid-September, they withdrew. They did not retreat to Smyrna. They established a new defensive line roughly halfway between the river and the coast. They intended to hold what they had and wait. The result of Sakarya was strategic, not tactical. The Greek offensive had failed. Athens could no longer credibly threaten Ankara. The nationalist government survived. More importantly, the failure demonstrated to France, Italy, and even some British officials that Greece could not impose Sèvres by force. The treaty required Greece to hold the territories it had been granted. It could not. Ankara spent the next year reorganizing. The Grand National Assembly passed laws to centralize military command, streamline logistics, and enforce conscription across the territories it controlled. Factories in Anatolia were converted to produce ammunition. Weapons were smuggled in from Soviet Russia. which saw Ankara as a useful counterweight to British influence in the region. The Turkish army grew in size and, more importantly, in coherence. What had been a collection of irregular units became a functioning military force. In August 1922, that force launched a coordinated offensive. The target was the Greek line west of Ankara. The operation was called the Great Offensive. Turkish forces concentrated against a weak point in the Greek defensive line near Afyon-Karahisar, a town controlling key roads into the western plateau. On August 26th, Turkish forces broke through. The Greek line collapsed. What followed was not a slow retreat, but a rout. The Battle of Dumlupinar, fought from August 26th to August 30th, was the decisive engagement. Turkish forces encircled a large portion of the Greek army. Greek units tried to break out. Some succeeded. Many did not. By August 30th, organized Greek resistance in the interior had ended. The remnants of the Greek army retreated toward Smyrna, the only port through which they could evacuate. Turkish forces reached Smyrna on September 9th, 1922. The Greek army boarded ships and left. So did tens of thousands of Greek civilians who had lived in the city for generations. A fire broke out in the city's Greek and Armenian quarters. The exact cause remains disputed. What is not disputed is that large sections of Smyrna burned and the departure of the Greek population became permanent. The Smyrna that had been a cosmopolitan port city with a Greek majority became Izmir, a Turkish city. The demographic transformation was violent and final. Britain, which still had forces near the straits at Chanak, considered intervening militarily to stop the Turkish advance. The British government issued warnings. Turkish forces approached the neutral zone around the straits. A confrontation seemed imminent, but Britain's coalition partners, France and Italy, refused to support military action. The British public, exhausted from the World War, opposed another war. The British commander on the ground, General Charles Harrington, negotiated directly with Turkish officers to avoid a clash. The Chanak Crisis, as it became known, ended without fighting. Britain backed down. Turkish forces stopped at the edge of the neutral zone. A ceasefire was arranged. The crisis confirmed what Dumlupinar had demonstrated. The military balance had reversed. The Allies could not enforce Sèvres. Ankara controlled Anatolia. In November 1922, the Grand National Assembly in Ankara voted to abolish the Sultanate. The institution, not just the person, was ended. The Ottoman dynasty had ruled for over 6 centuries. The assembly declared that sovereignty belonged to the nation, represented by the assembly itself. The last sultan, Mehmed Siksik, who had remained in Istanbul under British protection, was declared deposed. On November 17th, he left the Dolmabahce Palace secretly and boarded a British warship, HMS Malaya. He went into exile. He would die in Italy 4 years later. The Ottoman Empire did not end with Sèvres. It ended when Turks abolished it. The Allies now faced a choice. They could attempt to restore the Sèvres settlement by force, which would require a new war, or they could negotiate a new treaty with the government that actually controlled the territory. In November 1922, they invited Ankara to a peace conference. The location was Lausanne, Switzerland. The Turkish delegation was led by İsmet, the general who had won at İnönü and who now served as Ankara's foreign representative. The Allies were represented by Britain's Lord Curzon, France's foreign ministry officials, and Italy's diplomats. Greece attended, but as a defeated party, not an arbiter. The conference opened in November 1922 and continued with interruptions until July 1923. The negotiations were difficult. The Allies wanted to preserve as much of Sèvres as possible. Ankara wanted full sovereignty and territorial integrity. Every issue was contested. The borders, the status of the straits, the treatment of minorities, the Ottoman public debt, the capitulations that had granted foreign nationals legal immunity within Ottoman territory, all had to be renegotiated. Ankara's position was simple. It would accept no treaty that compromised Turkish sovereignty or left foreign zones of control within Anatolia. The Turkish delegation walked out of the conference in February 1923, when the Allies tried to impose terms similar to Sèvres. The conference resumed only after the Allies moderated their demands. The walkout was a negotiating tactic, but it was credible because Ankara controlled the territory and had the military capacity to defend it. The final treaty, signed on July 24, 1923, reflected the military facts. Turkey retained full control of Anatolia and eastern Thrace, the European side of the Straits up to the Maritsa River. Greece kept western Thrace and the Aegean Islands close to the Turkish coast, but Smyrna and its hinterland returned to Turkey. There would be no independent Armenia. There would be no autonomous Kurdistan. The Straits would be demilitarized and open to international shipping, but they would remain under Turkish sovereignty. The capitulations were abolished. Turkey would not pay reparations. It would assume a portion of the Ottoman debt, but under negotiated terms. The treaty included a population exchange. Greeks living in Anatolia, except for those in Istanbul, would be moved to Greece. Turks living in Greece, except for those in western Thrace, would be moved to Turkey. Religion, not language or self-identification, determined who was Greek and who was Turkish. The exchange was compulsory. Over 1 million people were uprooted. The human cost was immense. Families lost homes they had inhabited for centuries. But the exchange was intended to eliminate the minority populations that had been used as justifications for foreign intervention. It was brutal demographic engineering, but both governments accepted it as a way to stabilize borders. On October 29, 1923, the Grand National Assembly declared Turkey a republic. Ankara was confirmed as the capital. Mustafa Kemal was elected the first president. The new state was not the Ottoman Empire reformed. It was a different entity, legally and politically. It was secular. The caliphate, the religious leadership that sultans had claimed, was abolished in March 1924. It was national. The state defined itself by Turkish ethnicity and language, not by multi-ethnic imperial identity. It was westward-facing. The new government adopted the Latin alphabet, the Gregorian calendar, and European legal codes. It was republican. Power derived from the assembly, not from dynasty. Compare the two maps. In August 1920, Sèvres assigned Greece the Smyrna zone and eastern Thrace, Armenia an independent state in the east, Kurds an autonomous region in the southeast, Italy and France zones of influence in the south, and international control over the Straits. 3 years later, Lausanne recognized a unified Turkish state controlling all of Anatolia, eastern Thrace, and sovereignty over the Straits. The territories promised to Armenia and Kurdistan did not exist as independent entities. The zones granted to Greece, Italy, and France were gone. The treaty that was supposed to end the Ottoman Empire had been replaced by a treaty that created a new state on terms that state had fought for and won. The Ottoman Empire lasted 600 years. It ended not because the Allies partitioned it, but because the people living in its Anatolian core rejected partition, fought a multi-front war to reverse it, and forced the Allies to recognize a new reality. Modern Turkey emerged from that refusal. The war and the treaties did not simply end an empire. They demonstrated that imposed settlements fail when the population they govern chooses to resist and has the capacity to sustain that resistance. Sèvres was the ending the Allies wrote. Lausanne was the ending Ankara earned. The question remains, how did this transformation hold? The transition from empire to republic was not simply a matter of declaring new institutions. It required dismantling the structures that had defined Ottoman governance for centuries and replacing them with systems that could sustain a fundamentally different kind of state. The legal transformation came first. The Ottoman legal system had operated on religious principles, with separate courts for Muslims and non-Muslims. The new republic adopted the Swiss Civil Code in 1926, establishing secular law as the foundation of the state. Marriage became a civil contract, not a religious one. Inheritance followed codified rules, not religious interpretation. Women gained legal rights to divorce, child custody, and property ownership. These were not symbolic gestures. They were structural changes that redefined how the state related to its citizens. The educational system followed. Ottoman schools had been organized around religious instruction. The Republic created a unified secular education system under state control. Religious schools were closed or converted. The curriculum emphasized science, Turkish history, and civic responsibility. The goal was to produce citizens loyal to the Republic, not subjects loyal to a dynasty or a religious authority. This was a generational project. It would take decades to see the full effect, but the mechanism was in place by the mid-1920s. The economic shift was harder. The Ottoman Empire had been economically dependent on European capital and had granted capitulations, legal privileges that exempted foreign nationals and companies from Ottoman taxation and regulation. These capitulations had persisted even after the empire's military defeats. Lausanne abolished them. Turkey regained full economic sovereignty, but sovereignty without capacity is an empty status. The new republic inherited an economy devastated by a decade of continuous war. Infrastructure was damaged. Agricultural production had collapsed in many regions. Industrial capacity was minimal. Ankara responded with a state-directed development model. The government established the Business Bank in 1924 to fund industrial projects. It created monopolies in key sectors like tobacco, salt, and alcohol to generate revenue. It invested in railways to connect Anatolia's interior to ports and borders. These were not ideological commitments to state control. They were pragmatic responses to the absence of private capital and the need to build economic infrastructure quickly. The demographic transformation was the most brutal. The population exchange with Greece, mandated by Lausanne, displaced over 1.5 million people. Greek Orthodox Christians living in Anatolia were sent to Greece. Muslims living in Greece were sent to Turkey. The exchange was based on religion, not language or self-identification. Many of those sent to Greece spoke only Turkish. Many sent to Turkey spoke only Greek. Families were separated. Properties were abandoned. The human cost was immense, but the population exchange achieved what the treaty intended. It created ethnically and religiously homogeneous states. It eliminated the minority populations that European powers had used as pretexts for intervention throughout the 19th century. It removed the internal diversity that had been both a strength and a vulnerability of the Ottoman system. The new Turkey was not multi-ethnic. It defined itself as Turkish and Muslim, even though substantial Kurdish, Arab, and other populations remained within its borders. Those populations were expected to assimilate into the national identity the state was constructing. The political structure consolidated around a single-party system. Mustafa Kemal's Republican People's Party controlled the assembly. Opposition parties were attempted in 1925 and 1930, but were quickly suppressed. The stated reason was that the republic was still fragile, still under construction, and could not afford internal division. The actual effect was authoritarian rule, justified by the narrative of national survival. The state Ankara built was republican in structure, but not democratic in practice. This contradiction would define Turkish politics for the rest of the century. The republic was founded on the principle of popular sovereignty, but its institutions were designed to prevent the population from choosing policies that contradicted the state's foundational commitments to secularism, nationalism, and westernization. The military, in particular, saw itself as the guardian of these principles and intervened repeatedly when elected governments appeared to deviate from them. The international context mattered. Turkey's transformation occurred during a period when European empires were reasserting control over their colonial holdings, not dissolving. The British and French mandates in the former Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire were not pathways to independence. They were new forms of imperial administration. Turkey's success in achieving full sovereignty was an exception, not a trend. It was possible because Anatolia was not valuable enough to the Allies to justify the cost of continued military occupation, and because the Turkish nationalist movement demonstrated the capacity to impose unacceptable costs on any power that tried. This created a model. Ankara showed that a defeated power could reverse an imposed settlement through sustained resistance and strategic use of international divisions. That lesson was not lost on other anti-colonial movements, but it also required specific conditions: a defensible territory, a mobilized population, external powers with conflicting interests, and leadership capable of converting military success into diplomatic leverage. Those conditions do not appear everywhere. The transformation Lausanne recognized was not complete in 1923. The Republic spent the next 15 years implementing the changes the treaty made possible. Surname law in 1934 required all citizens to adopt family names, replacing the Ottoman naming system. Hat law in 1925 banned traditional headwear and mandated European-style hats, a symbolic but enforced break with Ottoman culture. Alphabet reform in 1928 replaced Arabic script with Latin letters, making Ottoman texts unreadable to the next generation and severing continuity with the past. These were not marginal adjustments. They were deliberate efforts to create a new national identity distinct from the imperial one. But the Ottoman past did not disappear. It remained in architecture, in family memory, in the social structures that persisted beneath the legal changes, and in the populations that did not fit neatly into the national identity the state promoted. The Kurdish population, in particular, resisted assimilation. Uprisings in 1925 and 1930 were suppressed militarily. The state's response was to deny the existence of a separate Kurdish identity, reclassifying Kurds as Mountain Turks and banning the Kurdish language in public life. This created a tension that would persist for the rest of the century and beyond. The question the treaties answered was not just how the Ottoman Empire ended, but what kind of state could be built in its place. Sèvres assumed the answer was partition, that the empire's diverse populations could not coexist in a single state and should be divided into smaller entities under external supervision. Lausanne accepted a different answer, that a unified state could be maintained if it redefined itself as national rather than imperial, if it homogenized its population through exclusion and exchange, and if it concentrated power in institutions capable of enforcing that identity. Modern Turkey is the result of that choice. It is not the only possible outcome. A different result in the War of Independence, a different negotiation at Lausanne, or a different set of decisions by Ankara in the 1920s could have produced a federal state, a restored sultanate under European supervision, or a collection of smaller republics. The outcome that occurred was contingent, not inevitable. It required military success, diplomatic skill, ruthless internal consolidation, and a willingness to pay the human cost of demographic engineering. The empire that lasted 600 years ended because its rulers chose the wrong alliance in 1914, lost the war that followed,